As requested, here is a single, uninterrupted, deeply expanded narrative of the Jane Britton case from start to finish, told top to bottom in continuous prose and explaining every publicly known detail while noting where the record is silent or disputed. In early January 1969, when Cambridge's winter light turned slate gray by mid-afternoon and Harvard Square was a churn of icy sidewalks and bundled students, 23-year-old Jane Britton was living on the 4th floor of a University Road apartment building just off the yard, balancing the anxious rhythms of a Harvard anthropology graduate student in exam season with the easy camaraderie of friends who skated, talked late, and traded stories about fieldwork and ancient rites. The daughter of J. Boyd Britton, a senior Standard Oil executive, and Ruth, often described as warm, cultured, and encouraging of her children's intellectual lives. Jane had grown up in Radnor, Pennsylvania, developed a strong artistic streak, and pursued archaeology with particular fascination for how the living honor the dead, a curiosity that made her both a serious scholar and, to friends, the kind of person who filled a small Cambridge apartment with books, drawings, and mementos of ideas she wanted to chase. On the evening of Monday, January 6, 1969, she joined classmates at a familiar Harvard Square spot for food and conversation before going ice skating with her boyfriend, and sometime shortly after midnight, accounts consistently place it a little past 12:30 a.m., she stopped in across the hall for a brief, neighborly nightcap of sherry, a friendly custom in a building where doors were often left unlocked and footfalls on the stairwell were as common as the hiss of radiators. Then she returned to her own 4th-floor unit to sleep, likely wearing a nightgown against the winter draft, with plans to sit for a significant anthropology exam the next morning, a checkpoint that mattered to her and that, to those who knew her, she would not have missed casually. By late morning on Tuesday, January 7, when she had failed to appear for the exam and failed to answer calls, concern shifted to dread, and her boyfriend, along with a neighbor, went to check her apartment, finding the front door unlocked and, inside, a tableau of sudden violence that would reverberate through Harvard for half a century. Jane lying face down on her bed, her nightgown pulled up over her head in a manner consistent with both humiliation and concealment, her upper body covered and bordered by household objects, a small rug and a fur coat notably placed over and around her, that read to investigators as post-assault staging rather than accident. The medical examiner documented severe blunt force trauma to the head, multiple blows causing skull fractures and fatal brain injury, and evidence of sexual assault, with the estimated time of death in the early morning hours, after she returned from her neighbors. The apartment showed signs of an intruder's path that did not heavily disturb the scene beyond the bed area, and investigators quickly developed the working theory that the killer had entered via the fire escape and a window, a common route in older Cambridge buildings without fully modernized security, especially on upper floors where residents felt safe enough to leave windows less fortified, while the absence of forced entry on the front door and the unlocked state on discovery left open but did not prove the possibility that the door was left unsecured after the attack, or that Jane, habitually trusting, had not latched it tightly when she came home. What turned the crime scene from horrific to myth magnet, however, was the presence of a fine red powder, red ochre, sprinkled on or near the victim and in the immediate area, a pigment long associated in many ancient cultures with burial rites and the coloring of the dead, and because Jane studied anthropology, this detail ignited the most sensational speculation. Was the killer someone from her academic orbit making a grotesque reference to funerary practice? Was it an attempt to mislead police? Or was it merely incidental pigment from an art or craft item present in the apartment that was transferred or scattered during the struggle? Early press breathed meaning into the ochre, and campus rumors swelled with theories, yet over time investigators emphasized that there was no reliable evidence the ochre reflected an archaeological ritual enacted by the killer, and that while its presence was striking, it did not, on its own, point to a colleague or to a particular motive beyond a violent sexual assault and murder. Detectives canvassed the building, interviewed classmates, friends, and faculty, and cross-checked known offenders in the area, but 1969 investigative tools were limited, physical evidence was finite, and despite numerous interviews and leads, some centered on the anthropology department's personalities and internal tensions, others veering toward generalized fear in the wake of 1960s Boston area crimes. No arrest followed, and the case slipped from an urgent hunt into a long, aching stalemate, with family members grieving in private and students graduating into adult lives that still remembered the shock of a classmate killed at home. In the decades that followed, the file never fully closed, and Cambridge Police and the Middlesex County District Attorney's Office carried it forward through occasional re-reviews as forensic technologies improved, yet early generations of DNA testing were not always possible on preserved items of the kind and condition available from a 1969 scene, and for long stretches the materials yielded nothing definitive. Meanwhile, the story sprouted cultural roots at Harvard and beyond. The victim's intelligence and promise, the locked-in mystery, the unsettling pigment, and a half-remembered roster of men who had intersected, however lightly, with her academic world created a rumor ecology that magnified whispers into shadowy narratives, even as the official investigation stayed disciplined, careful about what it could actually prove. In the 2010s, renewed journalistic attention pushed the case back into public view, but the decisive change came from the lab rather than the newsroom, when in 2017, modern testing extracted a male-specific YSTR profile from preserved biological evidence, a type of analysis that targets genetic markers on the Y chromosome and can be particularly useful when mixed samples or degraded material frustrate standard autosomal testing. That profile was searched against CODIS, the national database, and returned in association with a man whose name would alter the case's trajectory. Michael Sumpter, a Boston area offender with a record of violent sexual crimes in the same era, long known to law enforcement and, crucially, deceased since 2001 after serving time in prison. Because Sumpter was dead, investigators could not obtain a fresh sample from him, so to confirm the association they sought and obtained a comparison from a biological brother, a well-accepted method in YSR work given that male siblings share Y haplotypes, and the statistical strength of that familial confirmation, combined with the casework context and the elimination of other plausible sources, gave prosecutors the confidence to state publicly that the DNA from the crime scene was attributable to Sumpter to an extremely high degree of certainty, effectively excluding the overwhelming majority of unrelated males and collapsing decades of speculation into a single grim reality. The man who assaulted and killed Jane Britton was almost certainly a stranger to her, a predator who, based on his known behavior patterns, likely accessed her fourth-floor apartment from the fire escape under cover of winter darkness, committed the attack swiftly and brutally, staged the bed area with coverings afterward, and fled the way he came, leaving behind trace biological material that 1969 science could not decode but that 21st century techniques could. When the Middlesex County District Attorney's Office announced the identification in November 2018, they framed it as the oldest cold case their office had ever solved, and the message to the public and to the family was both precise and humane. The case was resolved by DNA and diligent work across generations of investigators. The lurid ochre theories had no evidentiary legs, and there was no credible proof that anyone in Jane's academic circle had been involved, a conclusion that finally pushed back against years of campus lore while acknowledging the legitimate questions that had gone unanswered for so long. For Jane's loved ones, the announcement brought an ambivalent form of closure: relief that the faceless fear had a name, sorrow that the man was already dead and could not be tried, and a recognition that the crisp clarity of a lab report cannot fully answer the human questions that persist when a life as vivid as Jane's is taken. Why this apartment on this night? What precise sequence of moments led from a neighborly glass of sherry to a fatal encounter? What snapped inside a predator who turned a scholar's bedroom into a crime scene layered with objects that generated decades of confusion? And how a university community carries the weight of a murder that becomes part of its institutional memory. In the aftermath of the announcement, the record now reads more cleanly than the rumor mill ever did. Jane spent the evening with friends, returned home after midnight, was killed in the small hours by a stranger whose modus operandi fit his known crimes. The red pigment at the scene was real but not proof of an academic ritual. Entry was most plausibly via the fire escape. The front door was found unlocked when concerned friends checked on her. The medical findings established sexual assault and fatal blunt force injury, and the resolution arrived nearly 50 years later when YSTR DNA profiling tied preserved evidence to Michael Sumpter and was confirmed through familial testing. Yet even with that clarity, the case is still told as a cautionary chord in Harvard's history and as an emblem of how modern forensics can speak across time. The thin thread of a preserved sample, the persistence of investigators who refused to file a life under unsolved, the restraint to separate rumor from fact, and the stark acknowledgement that some details, the exact minute-by-minute timeline inside the apartment, the precise source and intent of every speck of red ochre, the words, if any, that were spoken, the method by which the coverings were chosen from among the things at the foot of the bed, will never be known because the only witness who could tell them is gone, and the only perpetrator who could confirm them died long before the science that ultimately named him caught up.